So what exactly do you do, boys? Just teach pointless flight simulators. What's your call sign, anyway? Rain Sparrow. My younger sister Charlotte's shrill voice cut through the soft Christmas music. She stood in front of 20 upper-class guests smirking, pointing directly at my worn-out field uniform. My name is Laura. I am 34 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I had just dragged myself home after punching through a blizzard in the mountains of Montana to pull 14 people from the jaws of death. The smell of jet fuel still clung to every fiber of my clothes. The red silk dress Charlotte was wearing, the crackling fireplace in this mansion, all of it was paid for by the 70% of my hazard pay that I'd been sending home for the past 14 years. Yet my own mother seated me in the darkest corner of the dining table, smiling and nodding as she watched her golden child trample my dignity to entertain the crowd. But they didn't account for one variable. Charlotte's husband, a former Navy SEAL, was sitting right there. When I looked up, calmly gritting out my actual call sign, he dropped his crystal glass, let out a bone-chilling roar, and single-handedly shattered the pride and wealth of this wretched family. Let me know what state you're listening from in the comments and hit that subscribe button. If you've ever realized the bitter truth, the one who robs you of your self-worth the most ruthlessly is often the one sharing your bloodline. 3 hours earlier. The freezing rain in Atlanta felt like needles scraping against my face. I shoved a crumpled $20 bill through the cracked window of the cab. "Keep the change." The driver didn't say thanks. He just snatched the damp paper, threw the car into drive, and peeled away from the curb. His red taillights bled into the miserable gray afternoon, leaving me standing alone at the end of the long, perfectly paved driveway. There was no porch light on. Not a single bulb burning to welcome me back from hell. Just the imposing silhouette of the 3-story brick mansion I had been paying for since I was 20 years old. I hitched my frayed olive-drab military duffel higher on my shoulder. My body ached with a deep, bone-grinding exhaustion. I had been awake for 48 hours straight. Most of that time was spent gripping the vibrating cyclic of a search and rescue Black Hawk, fighting a white-out blizzard over the Rockies just to pull 14 stranded kids off a frozen ridge. The smell of aviation fuel, cold sweat, and raw fear was baked right into my pores. I walked up the stone steps. My tactical boots felt like they were cast in solid lead. I pushed open the heavy oak front door. It yielded without a sound. The contrast hit me like a physical blow. A wall of central heating rushed over my freezing skin. It carried the thick, suffocating stench of cinnamon-scented candles, expensive perfume, and roasting beef. It was the kind of aggressive manufactured holiday cheer that rich people bought by the gallon to mask how empty they were inside. I stepped fully into the foyer. Water dripped from the hem of my tactical jacket, pooling on the glossy hardwood. I looked down. The thick treads of my boots had just stamped dark, gritty Montana mud directly onto a pristine white Persian rug. I didn't care. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the glaring warm light. Operating purely on instinct, I assessed the room the same way I assessed a drop zone. 3 o'clock, a massive 12-foot Christmas tree touching the vaulted ceiling. It was weighed down by hundreds of crystal ornaments that caught the light and threw it against the walls like shattered glass. 9 o'clock, the dining room. A long mahogany table set for 20. Heavy silver cutlery. Crystal wine glasses. The guests were already there, a sea of tailored suits, expensive pearls, and flutes filled with pale, bubbling champagne. They were loud. A low, continuous roar of self-important chatter and fake laughter. And right in the center of the kill zone, the brightest spot in the room, was Charlotte, my younger sister. 31 years old and entirely hollow. She was twirling slightly, holding court in a stunning backless red silk dress. The fabric caught the light every time she moved. It looked expensive. It looked exactly like the 70% cut of my military hazard pay. The blood money I earned by hovering over avalanches and dodging power lines in the dark that was automatically deducted from my account every month to keep this family's mortgage from going into default. She threw her head back and laughed at something a guy in a velvet dinner jacket said. Nobody turned around when the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. Nobody noticed the pilot who had just paid for their alcohol, their heat, and their silk. I was a ghost in my own house. Then the crowd near the fireplace parted. My mother stepped out. She held a half-empty glass of red wine. Her hair was styled perfectly stiff with salon hairspray. She wore a tailored navy dress that I recognized from a Neiman Marcus catalog she had sent me a link to 3 months ago, with my credit card attached. She saw me, but she didn't rush forward. She didn't drop her glass. She didn't wrap her arms around the flesh and blood who had just spent 2 days defying gravity and death. She stopped dead in her tracks a good 6 feet away, as if my presence was a contagious disease. Her eyes, cold and calculating, did a quick sweep, but they didn't look at my face. They didn't check for bruises, cuts, or fatigue. Her gaze dropped straight from my soaked, stained military duffel bag down to the floor. She stared at the clumps of wet mud I'd tracked onto her white rug. Her jaw tightened, just a fraction. A microscopic flinch of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Laura," she said. Her voice was flat, dry, stripped of any human warmth. It wasn't the voice of a mother seeing her child alive. It was the tone of an irritated homeowner finding a blue-collar plumber standing in her foyer, tracking dirt into her clean house, arriving 2 hours late for a job. "You're back." A statement, not a question, not a greeting. I looked right back at her. I didn't blink. I didn't offer a single apology for the mud. The silence stretched between us, thick, ugly, and vibrating with 14 years of one-sided sacrifice. Weaponized ignoring. It was her specialty. She could look right through you and make you feel like you didn't even have a right to breathe her air. "Yeah," I said, my voice low, gravelly from lack of sleep. "I'm back." She offered a tight, closed-mouth smile, a polite dismissal. Then she turned her back on me and walked right back into the swarm of her rich, laughing guests. Message received. I unzipped my wet jacket. I didn't hand it to anyone. I didn't ask for a hanger. I simply draped the heavy, damp wool over the end of the mahogany staircase banister, leaving it there like a dark stain against the polished wood. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor with a heavy thud. I walked toward the dining room. I didn't push through the crowd. I bypassed the glowing center of the room entirely. I already knew there was no chair waiting for me where the light hit. I moved to the far end of the long dining table, the dark end. There was a single empty chair pushed awkwardly against the corner, sitting just outside the radius of the massive crystal chandelier overhead. The shadows hung heavy here. It was the table setting reserved for an afterthought, for the default debtor. I pulled the heavy wooden chair out. It scraped harshly against the floorboards. I sat down. I didn't slouch. Even in the dark, my spine was a steel rod, shoulders back, chin level. I rested my calloused, bruised hands on the edges of the table. The white porcelain plate in front of me was perfectly clean, perfectly empty. The noise from the party at the other end of the room felt like television static. Charlotte was laughing again, shrill, piercing. I slowly lifted my right hand. My knuckles were still swollen purple from wrestling the chopper's yoke through the crosswinds. I picked up the heavy silver dinner fork resting beside my empty plate. It was freezing to the touch. I held it loosely between my thumb and index finger. Then I let the tip of the fork drop. Clink. The sharp metallic sound of silver striking porcelain cut through the ambient noise in my head. Clink. It happened the exact second the metal hit the plate. A blinding, white-hot spike of agony shot straight up from my left shin. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a phantom blade slicing through scar tissue and bone memory, hijacking my nervous system in a fraction of a second. My breath hitched in my throat. My vision blurred around the edges. The sound of the fork hadn't just hit the plate. It had pulled the pin on a 12-year-old memory. A memory of shattered bone-freezing mud and a dial tone that hurt worse than the fracture itself. The metallic clink did not just echo in the quiet shadows of the dining room. It bypassed my ears, entirely traveled straight down my spine, and buried itself deep into the nerve endings of my left leg. 12 years vanished in a single ragged breath. I was 22 years old again, deep in the jagged terrain of the Cascade Mountains. SEER School. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. We were 72 hours into a simulated evasion drill behind enemy lines. I had no sleep, half a canteen of water, and muscles trembling from total glucose depletion. The freezing rain was turning into sleet, coating the steep granite cliff face in a thin, invisible layer of black ice. My fingers were entirely numb as I gripped the wet rope trying to find a solid foothold. A slip, a missed anchor point, just 2 inches of miscalculation. Gravity took over. I fell 10 feet. Free fall. I hit the jagged rock ledge below. I heard the snap a fraction of a second before I felt it. A sickening wet crunch that echoed over the howling mountain wind. My left tibia snapped completely in half. The violent force of the impact pushed the jagged white tip of the bone straight through muscle skin and the thick olive-drab fabric of my tactical pants. The pain did not hit immediately. First came the cold shock. Then the adrenaline wore off. Suddenly it felt like someone was pouring boiling battery acid directly onto my exposed, shredded nerve endings. I could not scream. My lungs completely forgot how to pull in air. I just looked down at the dark, thick arterial blood pulsing rapidly, pooling on the gray stone. 2 hours later, I was flat on my back on a freezing steel gurney inside a forward operating medical tent. The air was suffocating. It smelled like raw metallic copper from my own blood mixed with the sharp chemical burn of industrial rubbing alcohol. Above me, a combat medic with dirt under his fingernails and exhausted eyes was working fast. He did not speak. He just clamped a heavy nylon tourniquet high on my thigh. The pressure was a dull, crushing vice. He reached for his heavy metal trauma shears and began slicing through my ruined uniform, peeling the soaked fabric away from the mangled meat of my leg. My teeth were grinding together so hard I tasted chalk. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from clinical shock. I just wanted to hear my mother's voice. I was a soldier, but right then, bleeding out on a cold steel table, I was just a 22-year-old kid who desperately needed to believe her family gave a damn. I reached into my unzipped chest pocket with fingers caked in dried mud and dried blood. I pulled out my cheap, heavy cell phone. I dialed home. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3, 4, 5. Finally, the line clicked open. There was no worried greeting, no sudden panic. No, Laura, is everything okay? Instead, a blast of heavy bass and generic pop music assaulted my ear. I heard the distinct clinking of ice against crystal glasses, the overlapping, obnoxious chatter of a dozen wealthy voices. A party. What is it, Laura? My mother's voice cut through the background noise. It was not laced with concern. It dripped with raw, unfiltered irritation. I was an inconvenience. Mom! I gasped out. Every word tasted like copper. I had an accident. Training. My leg is broken. It is a compound fracture. They are prepping me to cut. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the sudden silence on the other end. I waited for the mother I always pretended I had to finally show up. Are you serious right now? She snapped. I froze. The burning agony in my leg momentarily vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow vacuum in the center of my chest. Mom, my bone is sticking out of my skin. And I have a house full of important guests, Laura. She hissed into the receiver, keeping her voice low so her friends would not hear. Charlotte just signed a modeling contract with a local boutique magazine. We are celebrating. It is her big night. I do not have the time or the patience to listen to your military whining right now. I lay there staring blankly at the canvas ceiling of the tent. You chose to go play soldier in the dirt. She continued, her voice practically dripping with venom. Charlotte is building a real future. Do not call here and ruin your sister's spotlight just because you tripped and scraped your knee. Put some ice on it and call back next week. Click. The call dropped. A flat, dead dial tone buzzed against my ear. I lay there under the harsh fluorescent lights. The medic stopped cutting. He looked down at me holding a syringe of morphine. He had heard the whole thing through the cheap phone speaker. His eyes were full of quiet, heavy pity. That pity hurt worse than the shattered bone. I let my bloody hand fall off the side of the gurney. The plastic phone hit the concrete floor and slid away into the shadows. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just lay there and let the very last shred of emotional attachment I had for my bloodline bleed out onto that steel table. That dial tone was the sound of my family cord being severed. Not by a scalpel, but by pure, unforgiving apathy. I realized right then that if I ever came home in a folded flag, my mother would only complain about the color of the coffin clashing with her living room curtains. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to do something for me. I need to know I am not the only one who has survived this kind of betrayal. Drop a comment below with the word survivor. If your family ever made you feel completely worthless when you needed them the most, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We need to stand together. The dial tone in my memory buzzed louder. It stretched across 12 years of empty holidays and unanswered letters. Beep! Then the sound morphed. The low electronic hum shifted in pitch, turning sharp and metallic. Clink, clink, clink. I blinked. The harsh fluorescent lights of the medical tent instantly dissolved. The heavy cinnamon-scented air of the dining room rushed back into my lungs. I was sitting at the dark end of the mahogany table. The silver fork was resting exactly where I dropped it on the white porcelain plate. The sound was coming from the center of the room. Charlotte was standing up in her backless red silk dress. She was holding a heavy crystal champagne flute in one hand, tapping it rhythmically with a silver spoon. Clink, clink, clink. The loud, obnoxious chatter of the wealthy guests quickly died down. 20 pairs of eyes turned to admire my sister. The golden child smiled, adjusting her perfect hair. She was ready to speak. I stared at her from the darkness. My breathing was perfectly even. I forced my heart rate to drop, beating at a slow, steady 60 beats per minute. The frightened kid on the gurney was dead. The soldier in the shadows was wide awake. Charlotte had the room exactly where she wanted it. She held the crystal champagne flute by the stem, her pinky finger slightly raised. She tilted her head at a perfect 45-degree angle. It was a highly calculated pose. I had seen Marine snipers put less thought into their firing positions. 20 guests stopped eating. They put down their heavy silver forks and turned their faces toward the warm, glowing light of the chandelier. Across the table from her, Ethan sat like a stone statue. He was Charlotte's husband, a former Navy SEAL. The custom black tuxedo he wore stretched dangerously tight across his broad shoulders. On him, it looked less like formal evening wear and more like a hostage situation. While the rest of the table looked at Charlotte with wide, adoring eyes, Ethan stared straight down. His eyes were locked onto a tiny, invisible crease in the white tablecloth. He did not blink. The muscles in his jaw feathered tight and rigid. It was the 1,000-yard stare. The hollow look of a man who had seen actual combat only to come home and find himself trapped in a completely different kind of war zone. A war zone made of imported silk, pathological lies, and maxed-out credit cards. I recognized that stare immediately. I respected it. But tonight, Ethan was just collateral damage. This year, Charlotte began. Her voice was breathy, trembling with rehearsed, manufactured emotion. This year has been such a massive challenge. A collective murmur of sympathy rolled through the wealthy crowd. Charlotte placed a delicate hand over her collarbone. Building my new boutique from the ground up, it nearly broke me. There were nights I was up until 11 o'clock. 11 at night, you guys. Just staring at silk swatches, trying to decide between crimson and burgundy. The stress was just unimaginable. A woman in a heavy pearl necklace sitting next to her nodded gravely, looking at Charlotte as if she had just survived a brutal tour in Fallujah. I reached out from the shadows and picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. The tap water was lukewarm, flat, completely tasteless. It matched the air in the room perfectly. I let the cold water slide down my throat, trying to wash away the harsh, metallic taste of adrenaline that was still lingering on the back of my tongue. 11 o'clock at night. While my little sister was crying over red fabric in a climate-controlled room, I was hovering a 60-foot piece of military metal over a jagged ridgeline in zero-visibility snow. I was fighting crosswinds that wanted to smash me into the mountain, praying my tail rotor would not clip a pine tree and kill all 14 people screaming in my cabin. But I did not speak. I just watched her over the rim of my glass. Charlotte's plastic smile widened. She turned her perfectly contoured face toward the head of the table, toward our mother. But I did not do it alone, Charlotte cooed. Her voice cracked right on cue. It was a great performance. I want to raise my glass to the one person who made this all possible. My rock, my sole financial backer, Mom. The dining room erupted in polite, hollow applause. My mother pressed a manicured hand to her chest. She picked up a pristine white linen napkin and gently dabbed at the corner of her completely dry eye. She looked at Charlotte and mouthed the words, "I am so proud of you." I set my water glass down on the wood. I looked at the linen napkin in my mother's hand. I looked at the massive crystal chandelier hanging above their heads. I looked at the red silk dress clinging to my sister's waist. I paid for that napkin. I paid for the electricity running to that chandelier. I paid the commercial lease on that boutique. For 14 years, the United States military deposited my base pay and my hazard pay into a joint account my mother controlled. I set it up when I was young and stupid, trying to save the family home from foreclosure after Dad died. 14 years of missing holidays. 14 years of sleeping on freezing concrete floors. 14 years of writing letters I hoped would never have to be mailed to my next of kin. I bought the roof over their heads with my blood, and they were standing directly under it, completely erasing my existence to my face. The urge to stand up and flip the heavy mahogany table was there. It was a hot, violent spark firing in the back of my brain. My hands twitched. I killed the spark instantly. A soldier never interrupts the enemy when they are busy exposing their flank. If you want to destroy a fortified structure, you do not punch the outer walls. You wait until they bring everyone inside, lock the doors, and then you pull the main load-bearing pillar. I reached down and picked up my own napkin. I folded it in half, then in quarters. I made a perfect, crisp square. I flattened the edges with my thumb. Military precision. The repetitive action kept my hands from shaking. It kept the cold anger locked safely in the freezer. The applause finally died down. Charlotte took a delicate sip of her champagne and sat back down, glowing under the validation of strangers. The waitstaff moved in. They were silent, wearing white gloves, carrying heavy silver trays. The rich smell of roasted meat and butter-soaked pastry filled the room as thick cuts of beef Wellington were placed in front of the guests. Nobody brought a plate to the dark end of the table. I was not factored into the catering headcount. The clinking of expensive silverware resumed. The conversation shifted. Charlotte had taken her moment in the spotlight. The parasites needed a new topic to chew on with their expensive beef. 2 seats down from Charlotte, a man cleared his throat. He had the slicked back hair of a hedge fund manager and a thick gold Rolex that cost more than an armored Humvee. He wiped grease from his mouth with the back of his hand and leaned forward, eager to command the room. "Speaking of surviving tough situations," the banker said loudly, projecting his voice so the entire table could hear him over the music. "Did anyone happen to catch the national news broadcast last night?" The dining room went quiet again. Forks paused mid-air. "That massive avalanche up at Denali Pass?" He continued, pointing his expensive steak knife toward the ceiling for dramatic effect. "They were talking about that Navy rescue chopper." I stopped folding my napkin. My thumb pressed hard into the white fabric, pinning it to the table. My eyes flicked from the napkin to the banker. The shadows in my corner of the room suddenly felt very, very cold. The rich, buttery smell of beef Wellington hung heavy in the heated air. The waitstaff moved seamlessly around the glowing center of the table, serving thick cuts of medium-rare meat wrapped in flaky pastry. 2 seats down from Charlotte, the hedge fund manager wiped grease from his lips with a white linen napkin. He wore the kind of smug, overfed expression that only came from playing with other people's money. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure the entire table was looking at him before he spoke. Speaking of surviving tough situations, he projected, leaning back in his heavy mahogany chair. "Did anyone happen to catch the national news broadcast last night, that massive avalanche up at Denali Pass?" The clinking of silverware slowed. A few heads nodded. "Absolute madness." The banker continued, gesturing with his fork. 14 kids trapped on a school field trip. Ground crews couldn't reach them. Total whiteout conditions. Then some Navy pilot actually took a chopper straight into the center of the storm. Flew right into the teeth of it. A woman wearing a thick pearl necklace gasped, bringing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. "Oh, I saw that on morning television. It was completely insane. They said the crosswinds were strong enough to snap the rotor blades in half." "Exactly," the banker agreed, nodding like an expert. The anchor called her, what was it? The night warden. That was her military call sign. Managed to winch every single one of those kids up before the rest of the ridge collapsed. That is not just skill. That is steel nerves. A murmur of awe rippled down the table. They sat there in their tailored suits and silk dresses, cutting into expensive beef, sipping imported wine, and chewing on the terrifying near-fatal reality of someone else's life like it was nothing more than an after-dinner mint. They wore their fake empathy like cheap cologne. It was the ultimate upper-class sport, virtue signaling, praising the blood and grit of the working class from the absolute safety of a heated mansion just to prove they had a soul. In the dark corner of the room, my hand stopped moving. I was holding a heavy silver steak knife. The tip was hovering an inch above my empty porcelain plate. I gripped the thick handle until my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. I brought the knife down. Hard. The sharp point bit directly into the smooth white ceramic. It didn't break the plate, but the force of it sent a violent shockwave up my forearm. My left shoulder jerked. A hot, sharp spike of pain ripped through my collarbone. It was the exact spot where the heavy flight harness had dug into my flesh for 6 agonizing hours, while I fought the cyclic control of the Black Hawk, desperately trying to keep a 12,000-pound machine from slamming into a mountain of solid ice. Underneath my stiff, salt-stained uniform, my shoulder was currently painted in deep, ugly shades of purple and black. My skin was still raw. My muscles were screaming for rest. I locked my jaw. I stared at the back of the banker's head. I was the steel nerves he was talking about. I was the one who smelled the electrical smoke in the cockpit when the warning lights flared. I was the one who heard the terrifying, deafening crack of the ice shelf giving way just seconds after we pulled the last freezing, crying teenager into the cabin. I was the night warden. And I was sitting exactly 10 feet away from them, hidden in the shadows like a dirty secret, treated worse than the hired help who brought them their food. I just cannot fathom that kind of bravery. The woman with the pearls sighed dramatically, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. To risk your own life like that, it is so noble. They do not pay those military folks enough, I tell you. A guy in a velvet blazer chimed in, shaking his head. Absolute heroes. I tasted copper. I had bitten the inside of my cheek so hard it bled. I looked at my mother. She was nodding along with the crowd, her face a perfect mask of polite upper-middle-class sympathy. She was agreeing that the Navy pilot on television was a hero, while her actual daughter, the one paying the mortgage on the chair she was sitting in, sat starving in the dark, her boots still wet with snowmelt. It was a sick, twisted joke. But I wasn't laughing. The adulation for the unknown pilot kept rolling down the table. And as the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere in the center of the room began to shift. I watched Charlotte. The glow of validation had completely vanished from her contoured face. Her perfect manufactured smile was beginning to slip, the corners of her mouth twitching downward. The room was no longer looking at her. They were no longer talking about her struggles with silk swatches or her brilliant boutique. Her spotlight had been stolen by a ghost on a television screen. Jealousy is a physical thing. You can see it happen. Charlotte's hand tightened around the stem of her crystal flute. Her long acrylic nails scraped against the delicate glass. A sharp, ugly sound. She hated it. She hated not being the center of the universe. She needed the attention back, and she needed it right now. She needed someone to step on to elevate herself again. Her eyes darted around the table, cold and frantic. She was looking for a target, a punching bag. Then she looked past the chandelier, past the laughing guests, past the expensive beef. Her eyes cut through the shadows and locked directly onto me. She took in my damp, messy hair, the dark bags under my eyes, the olive-drab tactical uniform that smelled like aviation fuel and old sweat, the heavy boots staining the floor. I saw the exact moment the malicious thought formed in her head. Her lips curled upward into a slow, venomous smirk. She ran her thumb over the edge of her champagne glass. Target acquired. Charlotte's manicured thumb stopped tracing the rim of her champagne flute. She picked up her silver spoon. Clink, clink, clink. She struck the delicate crystal just hard enough to silence the chatter about the avalanche. The banker closed his mouth, his fork suspended halfway to his face. The entire table turned back to the glowing center of the room. Charlotte had the floor again. She offered the crowd a soft, self-deprecating sigh, tilting her head so the chandelier caught the expensive highlights in her hair. Speaking of dedication, Charlotte cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She did not look at the banker. She turned her head slowly, dragging the attention of 20 wealthy guests all the way down to the darkest unlit corner of the mahogany table. Directly at me. It is funny how we all define the word differently, isn't it? She leaned forward, slightly resting her elbows on the table. The red silk of her dress pooled around her waist. Some of us build real businesses. We create jobs. We generate actual GDP for the economy. And then, she let the silence hang for a split second, allowing her eyes to rake over my olive drab tactical jacket hanging on the banister, the mud on my boots, the exhaustion carved into my face. And then there are people who just love throwing their youth away, hiding out in some remote, dreary military base, following dry, pointless orders only to come dragging home looking like a stray dog off the street. A few stifled snickers rippled through the guests. The woman with the pearl necklace hid a smile behind her napkin. I did not flinch. I did not shift my weight in the heavy wooden chair. I sat perfectly still, breathing in through my nose, out through my mouth. Slower, colder. I mean seriously, Laura, Charlotte said, dropping the sweet tone. She lifted her chin, staring down her nose at me. The venom was out in the open now. What exactly is it that you do out there in the dirt? Just teach a bunch of high school dropouts how to fly those pointless little video game simulators. You act so superior because you wear a uniform, but let's be honest. Wearing camouflage does not make you noble. It just means you could not cut it in the real corporate world. The table was dead quiet now. The kind of quiet that follows a public execution. They were rich, bored, and hungry for drama. They watched me, waiting to see if the stray dog would bark. I did not look at my sister. I looked past the red silk dress, past the crystal glasses and the expensive beef. I looked directly at my mother. She was sitting at the head of the table, bathed in the warm golden light of the chandelier. Her perfect makeup caught the glow. She had a front row seat to the slaughter. She saw me looking at her. For one brief, fragile second, our eyes met across the long expanse of polished wood. I waited. Just one word. One simple, "Charlotte, that is enough." One tiny fraction of maternal defense. That was all it would take to prove that the last 14 years of my blood, sweat, and hazard pay meant something. Anything. My mother held my gaze. She crossed her arms over her chest, and slowly, deliberately, she nodded. She was agreeing with Charlotte. She was validating every single vicious, humiliating word my sister had just spat at me. In her eyes, I was not the savior of this family's finances. I was not a highly trained aviator. I was exactly what Charlotte said. I was a blue-collar failure playing dress-up in the dirt. That nod was the sharpest blade I had ever felt. It cut cleaner and deeper than the jagged rock that shattered my leg 12 years ago. It was over. The microscopic, pathetic thread of hope I had been dragging around for over a decade snapped completely. The bridge connecting me to the concept of family collapsed into dust. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute clarity. Charlotte saw the exchange. She saw our mother's nod. Emboldened by the supreme authority in the room, she decided to go for the kill. She wanted the big laugh. She wanted to cement her status as the apex predator of the dining room. She leaned even further across the table, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. So tough. So brave! Charlotte mocked, her voice rising to a shrill, theatrical pitch. Tell us, Commander Laura, if you are such a badass out there in the wild, what is your big, scary call sign anyway? She paused, looking around at the wealthy guests to make sure they were ready for the punchline. What is it? Rain Sparrow. Charlotte threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, braying sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. A few of the guests chuckled along with her, eager to stay on the good side of the boutique owner and her rich mother. The laughter bounced around the edges of my skull. It mixed with the smell of cinnamon candles, roasting meat, and the sickening stench of extreme arrogance. I slowly unclasped my hands. I opened my eyes, fully locking my gaze dead onto my sister's mocking face. I picked up the heavy silver steak knife I had been gripping. I did not throw it. I did not stab it into the table. I simply let it fall from my fingers. Clatter. The heavy silver hit the porcelain plate. It was not a loud noise, but in the sudden vacuum of my total stillness, it sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Charlotte's laughter died in her throat. The smirk froze on her lips. She looked at me confused by the absolute lack of emotion on my face. She expected tears. She expected me to storm out of the house. She expected a victim. She had no idea she had just pulled the pin on a grenade, and I was not going to throw it. I was going to drop it right in the center of her perfect, expensive life. I leaned forward into the light. Just a few inches. Enough for the glow of the chandelier to catch the heavy bags under my eyes and the dark, dried grease staining the collar of my uniform. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of a temper tantrum. I kept my hands resting flat on the mahogany table, palms down. My voice was flat. Cold. The kind of absolute dead calm tone you use over a radio when an engine catches fire at 10,000 feet. No, I said, cutting straight through Charlotte's lingering laughter. I do not teach on simulators. I fly active combat search and rescue. I paused. I let my eyes drift from my mother's pale face past the shocked expressions of the wealthy guests and finally locked them dead onto my sister. And my call sign, I said, dropping the volume of my voice so they all had to lean in to hear it, is Night Warden. For exactly 2 seconds, the room was suspended in complete silence. No one breathed. The soft jazz playing through the hidden ceiling speakers sounded incredibly loud. Then the static broke. Crash! Directly across from Charlotte, Ethan dropped his heavy crystal glass. It hit the edge of his bone-white porcelain dinner plate and shattered. Sharp shards of expensive crystal exploded across the table. Dark ruby red wine splashed out, pooling instantly onto the pristine white linen tablecloth like a fresh, ugly bloodstain. But Ethan did not flinch at the broken glass. He did not grab a napkin to wipe his expensive tuxedo. He froze. His massive chest stopped moving. He was not breathing. His eyes, which had been dead and hollow all night, were suddenly wide open. They darted from the red stain on the table straight to me. The look on his face shifted in a fraction of a second. It went from complete shock to dawning realization, and finally to absolute, unadulterated awe. He was a former Navy SEAL. He knew exactly what it took to punch a 12,000-pound helicopter through a Denali blizzard. He knew the body count that usually came with a whiteout. He knew the mathematical impossibility of pulling 14 kids off a collapsing ridge in the dark. He knew what a true warrior looked like, and he realized he was sitting at a table full of parasites watching them feed on one. The color drained entirely from Charlotte's face. She looked at the broken glass, then at her husband. "Ethan, what are you doing? You are making a mess." She started, her voice tight with embarrassment. Slam. Ethan brought both of his massive hands down onto the thick mahogany table. The impact was violent. It rattled the heavy silver cutlery against the plates. The water in my glass shook. The entire dining room physically flinched. "Apologize to her." The sound ripped out of Ethan's chest. It was not a yell. It was a guttural, bone-rattling roar. It was the lethal, unfiltered fury of a Tier 1 operator violently breaching the polite plastic bubble of a dinner party. Charlotte physically recoiled. She threw her hands up, pressing herself hard into the back of her chair. Her eyes were wide with genuine terror. She'd spent 5 years dressing Ethan up in custom suits and parading him around like a shiny trophy. She'd clearly forgotten there was a trained killer living underneath the velvet lapels. "Apologize to her, right now!" Ethan roared again, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. My mother dropped her napkin. The hedge fund manager who had brought up the news story shrank down into his seat, his smug expression entirely wiped out. Ethan stood up. He did not push his chair back. He just kicked it out of the way. The heavy wood screeched against the floorboards and tipped over backwards. He leaned across the table, completely ignoring the broken glass and the spilled wine soaking into his cuffs. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly an inch from his wife's face. She flew into the eye of a Category 3 storm, "You ignorant little brat." Ethan snarled, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register that echoed off the high ceiling. Every single word was a hammer blow. "She saved 14 lives last night. 14 kids get to see their mothers today because of her. She is the night warden, you stupid, ungrateful fool. Charlotte's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish on a dock. No sound came out. The aggressive, mocking alpha female from 30 seconds ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified child staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. Do not ever! Ethan breathed heavily, his eyes blazing with a kind of hatred I had never seen him show before. Do not ever speak to a superior officer like that again. Not in my presence. He slowly pulled his finger away. He stood up straight, towering over the table. He did not look at his wife anymore. He turned his head and looked down the long expanse of the table straight at me. The former SEAL brought his right hand up in a slow, deliberate movement. Not a salute. Just a subtle, sharp tap of his knuckles against his chest right over his heart. Respect. From one operator to another. I did not move. I just gave him a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. The entire dining room was paralyzed. The soft jazz was still playing, turning the scene into a bizarre, muted play. 20 wealthy, powerful people sat completely frozen, staring at the mud on my boots and the grease on my collar, suddenly realizing they had just publicly mocked the very person they were praising 5 minutes ago. The silence was deafening. It was the sweet, heavy silence of absolute victory. Have you ever had someone step up and defend you when your own family threw you to the wolves? It changes everything, doesn't it? Drop a comment down below with the word justice if you have ever felt that kind of relief. Hit the like button to show some respect for the people who actually have your back, and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. The air in the room was completely sucked dry. Charlotte was crying now, silent tears ruining her expensive makeup. My mother was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her mouth hanging open. But the execution was not over. At the far head of the table, sitting right next to my mother, the oldest man in the room began to move. Vice Admiral Walter. Retired. A 3-star flag officer and the primary venture capitalist funding Charlotte's entire boutique empire. He placed both hands on the heavy wooden handle of his cane. The joints in his fingers cracked loudly. Slowly, painfully, the Admiral pushed himself up from his chair. I did not look at Ethan. I did not look at my mother. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. I stood up. My spine locked into place, shoulders squared, chin parallel to the floor. The exhaustion in my bones was completely gone, burned away by the cold, sterile focus of a combat aviator. I reached up and unzipped the breast pocket of my damp, olive-drab tactical jacket. My fingers brushed past the thick nylon fabric and pulled out a small, heavy object. I held it over the empty porcelain plate. I opened my hand. Clank. It hit the ceramic hard, solid silver. A pair of naval aviator wings, the wings of gold. The pin was slightly bent, the metal scratched and dulled from years of rubbing against flight harnesses and survival gear. It was not jewelry. It was a brand, earned in blood, sweat, and freezing ocean water. Yes, I said. My voice carried down the long expanse of the mahogany table, cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade. I sat in the dark tonight and listened to you mock the uniform that keeps you safe while you sleep in your heated beds. No one moved. 20 pairs of eyes stared at the silver wings resting on the plate. At the far head of the table, sitting in the absolute center of the chandelier's light, Vice Admiral Walter pushed himself up. He was 72 years old. Retired 3-star flag officer. He had spent 40 years commanding aircraft carriers and entire fleets before retiring to become a ruthless venture capitalist. He was the man my mother had spent 6 months courting. He was the primary investor funding Charlotte's entire boutique empire. His money bought the red silk. His money bought the champagne. He was the undisputed king of this dining room. He grabbed his heavy wooden cane. The thick rubber tip hit the hardwood floor. Thud. He stepped away from his chair. Thud. The crowd parted instantly. The wealthy guests pulled their chairs in, shrinking back as the old man moved down the length of the table. His face was a mask of carved granite. He did not look at the banker. He did not look at my mother, who was currently clutching her chest, looking like she was about to go into cardiac arrest. He reached the center of the table. Charlotte was standing there shivering in her backless dress, her face streaked with ruined makeup. She looked at the Admiral. She opened her mouth, desperate to salvage the situation, desperate to save her money. "Admiral Walter, please." Charlotte stammered, her voice shaking. I had no idea. It is just a misunderstanding." Walter did not even break stride. He raised his left hand and shoved her aside. It was not a gentle push. It was a hard, dismissive sweep of his arm. He swatted the golden child of the family out of his path like she was an irritating insect. Charlotte stumbled backward, her expensive heels catching on the Persian rug. She crashed hard into the wall, knocking a framed painting askew. Walter did not look back. He kept walking into the shadows. Thud. 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 He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. Up close, I could see the deep lines carved into his face, the faint white scar running along his jawline from a piece of shrapnel in Vietnam. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath his tailored suit. He looked down at the scratched silver wings resting on the porcelain plate. Then he looked up at me. The old man let go of his wooden cane. It clattered loudly to the floor, rolling away into the darkness. He did not care. He forced his curved, aching spine to straighten. He pulled his shoulders back. He planted his feet together. Crack! His leather heels slammed together. The sound was sharp, precise. A reflex ingrained in his muscle memory for half a century. Slowly, his right hand came up. His fingers were stiff with arthritis, but his form was absolutely flawless. He brought his hand to the edge of his right eyebrow, a full standard-issue naval salute, from a 3-star admiral to a lieutenant commander. The air in the room completely evaporated. I could hear the woman with the pearls gasp out loud. I saw my mother slump forward, her face burying itself in her hands. I immediately snapped my right hand up, returning the salute, my elbow parallel to the ground, fingers straight. I held it there, locking eyes with the old warrior. "The final extraction," Walter said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It shook slightly. "The last teenager you pulled up into the cabin right before the ice shelf collapsed into the ravine." He swallowed hard. I saw a single thick tear break loose and track its way down his weathered cheek. "That was my grandson." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Charlotte let out a small, pathetic whimper from where she was pressed against the wall. She finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. "I have millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts." The Admiral continued, his voice growing louder, hardening into steel. "I own properties on 3 continents, but all the money I possess could not have bought my grandson's life back from that mountain." He dropped his salute. I dropped mine. He reached out and placed his heavy, trembling hand on my bruised shoulder, the exact spot where the flight harness had dug into my skin. He gripped it tightly. "This country," Walter said, his eyes burning into mine, ignoring everyone else in the room, "and my entire family line, owes this officer a debt we can never repay." He slowly turned his head. He looked back at Charlotte, trembling against the wall. He looked at my mother, hiding her face in her hands. The look of pure, unadulterated disgust on his face was terrifying. It was the look of a man who was about to burn an entire empire to the ground just on principle. "And as for the rest of you," the Admiral said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "you make me sick." The words hung in the air like an executioner's axe. "You make me sick." Vice Admiral Walter did not yell. He did not need to. True power never raises its voice. He shot one final blistering look of pure disgust at my mother. Then he turned his back on the entire room. He did not bother picking up his cane. He did not say a single word of goodbye to the people he had been funding. He just walked out of the dining room, his heavy leather shoes echoing against the hardwood, leaving behind a silence so thick you could choke on it. The financial guillotine had just dropped. Charlotte's legs gave out. She collapsed backward, hitting the expensive dining chair so hard it slid back a few inches. The red silk dress bunched up around her thighs. She stared blankly at the empty doorway where her primary investor had just disappeared. It was over. Instant cancellation. Without Walter's offshore money, her empire was nothing but a stack of maxed-out credit cards and an overpriced commercial lease she could not afford by the end of the month. At the head of the table, my mother was physically malfunctioning. Her jaw hung open. The half-empty glass of red wine slipped right through her perfectly manicured fingers. Thump! The glass hit the thick Persian rug. It did not shatter, but a dark, ugly stain of Cabernet Sauvignon immediately soaked into the pristine white wool, spreading outward like a slow-moving infection. She did not even look down. Her brain was running the numbers. Her golden child was ruined. Her billionaire backer was gone. The only source of income left in this entire mansion was the 70% cut of hazard pay from the daughter she had just spent the last 20 minutes humiliating in front of 20 upper-class witnesses. I looked at the two women sitting at the table. They shared my blood, but looking at them right now, they felt like complete strangers. Small, pathetic, hollow. I did not feel any anger anymore, just a cold, absolute detachment. I picked up my damp tactical jacket from the back of the chair. I slid my bruised arms into the heavy wool sleeves. I reached down, grabbed the thick strap of my military duffel bag, and slung it over my shoulder. I looked at my mother. "I fight for honor," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "I protect human life. Those are concepts this house will never ever understand." I turned my back on the dining room. I did not wait for a response. I walked straight toward the heavy oak front door. "Laura, wait, stop." The frantic sound of expensive high heels clicking rapidly across the hardwood floor echoed behind me. I reached the door, I grabbed the brass handle, and pulled it open. The biting Atlanta sleet whipped directly into my face, bringing with it the sharp, clean smell of freezing rain and wet asphalt. I stepped out onto the porch. "Laura, please." My mother burst through the doorway right behind me. The freezing wind immediately destroyed her stiff salon hair. The sudden change in temperature made her eyes water, mixing with the heavy foundation and expensive mascara on her face. Dark, ugly streaks ran down her cheeks. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my tactical jacket. Her grip was tight, desperate. I had no idea. She stammered, her chest heaving. "I did not know the missions you were flying were so dangerous. I did not know you were risking your life like that. Laura, honey. Mom is so sorry." I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. It was the first time she had touched me in 3 years, and she was only doing it because the Vice Admiral had pulled his funding. The apology smelled like pure, unadulterated financial panic. There was zero maternal warmth in her eyes, only the terrifying realization that her safety net was walking out the door into the freezing rain. I reached over with my right hand. I peeled her manicured fingers off my uniform, one by one. "You knew," I said, staring dead into her panicked eyes. "You just didn't care until the checkbook closed. You set me up." The shrill, hysterical scream came from inside the foyer. Charlotte came charging out onto the porch, pushing past our mother. The freezing sleet hit her bare shoulders, but she did not seem to feel it. Her face was twisted into an ugly, animalistic mask of pure rage. "You planned this," Charlotte shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "You knew Walter was coming tonight. You brought that stupid little pin to show off and humiliate me in front of my friends. You ruined my life." She was completely unhinged. The narcissist's ultimate defense mechanism when confronted with the consequences of their own actions, play the victim. I did not step back. I dropped my heavy duffel bag onto the wet concrete. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. I invaded her personal space entirely. I was taller, broader, and I had just spent 2 days fighting a mountain. Charlotte stopped screaming. She instinctively shrank back against the brick wall of the house, her eyes wide. I leaned in. My face was inches from hers. "I didn't humiliate you, Charlotte," I said quietly, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "I just held up a mirror. What you saw tonight was your own ugly reflection." She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "And for the record," I whispered, holding her gaze until she was forced to look away, "strong people do not need to scream." I picked up my duffel bag from the freezing concrete. At the bottom of the driveway, the yellow headlights of a taxi idled in the sleet. I had ordered it from my phone while Ethan was screaming at the table. I walked down the wet stone steps. I didn't look back at the mansion. I didn't look at the two women standing on the porch shivering in the cold, their empire collapsing around their ankles. I reached the taxi. I opened the heavy rusted metal door. I threw my bag into the back seat, slid in after it, and pulled the door shut. Slam. The heavy metal sound echoed down the long, dark driveway. Airport, I told the driver. The cab pulled away from the curb, leaving the house, the lies and the bloodline entirely behind in the rearview mirror. The morning light filtering through the cheap plastic blinds was gray and washed out. I was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in a military transient motel 3 miles from the base. The air conditioning unit rattled violently in the window. The entire room smelled like stale cigarette smoke covered up by heavy industrial bleach. It was ugly. It was bare bones. But it was quiet. I held my phone in my right hand. The screen was a cracked web of glass glowing brightly in the dim room. 34 unread text messages. 14 missed calls. All received between midnight and 6 a.m. The fallout from Vice Admiral Walter's exit had been swift and utterly merciless. I scrolled past the first block of texts. They were from my mother. It was a rapid, escalating descent into total financial panic. "Laura, please pick up. We need to talk about the mortgage." Walter pulled his backing. "The bank is calling. You can't just leave us like this. Answer your phone. You owe me." The progression was textbook. She started with fake pleading, moved to manipulation, and ended exactly where she always did, demanding that I pay for her existence. I didn't open a single one of her messages. I just swiped down. The next block of texts was from Charlotte. They were entirely in capital letters. Pure, unfiltered hysteria. "You ruined everything. The suppliers canceled the contracts. How could you do this to your own sister? I am going to lose the store." Her little boutique empire had crumbled before the sun even came up. A business built entirely on someone else's hazard pay and a billionaire's pity check. The second the fake foundation was kicked out from under her, the whole structure collapsed. I felt nothing. No guilt. No sick pleasure. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The kind of absolute zero you feel when you finally stop trying to resuscitate a corpse. I kept scrolling until I hit the very last message. It was from Ethan, sent at 3:14 a.m. Charlotte completely melted down, screaming, throwing things. I had to call her therapist. "Your mother locked herself in the master bedroom with a bottle of gin. They are tearing each other apart over the money." There was a space, then one final line. "You did the right thing, Commander. Do not look back." I stared at that last line for a long time. The only piece of validation I had ever received from that house came from the man they kept chained up in a tuxedo. I tapped the power button on the side of the phone. The screen went black, plunging my reflection into the cracked glass. I reached into the side pocket of my tactical pants and pulled out a small metal paperclip. I bent it straight. I pressed the sharp end of the wire into the tiny pinhole on the side of the phone. The SIM card tray popped out with a soft click. I pulled the tiny plastic square out. I pinched it between my thumb and index finger. I didn't hesitate. I didn't say a dramatic goodbye to the empty room. Snap. The SIM card broke cleanly in half. The tiny gold microchip splintered. I leaned over and dropped the 2 broken pieces of plastic directly into the cheap aluminum trash can next to the bed. 34 years of emotional abuse, financial blackmail, and toxic blood ties ended by a single microscopic piece of plastic. I didn't scream. I didn't curse them out. I didn't waste my breath trying to explain my pain to people who were fundamentally incapable of empathy. Narcissists feed on attention. They crave the fight. They want you to scream so they can play the victim. Total absolute silence is the only weapon they cannot defend against. Going zero contact is not a punishment. It is an amputation. You cut off the infected limb so the rest of the body can finally survive. I tossed the useless phone onto the mattress. Across the small room, resting on the scarred Formica desk, my heavy military Panasonic laptop lit up. Beep. The encrypted notification sound cut through the low hum of the air conditioner. I stood up. My boots thudded against the thin carpet. I walked over to the desk and hit the spacebar. The screen required a thumbprint and a 12-digit passcode. I entered both. An email from Naval Special Warfare Command. Priority Alpha. I clicked it open. The text was brief, stripped of any pleasantries. Pure military operational protocol. Lieutenant Commander Laura Hall. Effective immediately. Orders modified. You are hereby reassigned to Northline Rescue Detachment, Kodiak, Alaska. Role Detachment Commander. Transport departs Elmendorf AFB at 1400 hours. Acknowledge receipt. Alaska. The edge of the world. A place where the mountains tried to kill you on a daily basis. The ocean froze solid and the wind howled louder than any human voice. It was a place where nobody cared what kind of dress you wore or what kind of car you drove. They only cared if you could hold the line when the ice started cracking. It was perfect. I reached down and placed my fingers on the heavy rubberized keyboard. Orders received, I typed. The keys clacked loudly in the quiet room. Wheels up at 1400. Ready for deployment. I hit send. I closed the heavy laptop with a solid, satisfying thud. I grabbed my duffel bag off the floor and slung it over my shoulder. I walked out of the motel room and let the heavy metal door lock behind me. 3 years later. Kodiak, Alaska. The wind off the Bering Sea did not just blow. It screamed. It battered the thick, corrugated steel walls of Hangar 4 with the blunt, heavy force of a runaway freight train. Every metal joint in the massive building groaned under the pressure. Inside the air was a thick industrial mix of JP-8 aviation fuel, damp wool, and wood smoke. I stood by the massive cast-iron potbelly stove in the center of the ready room. I held a scratched steel mug in my right hand. The black coffee inside was lukewarm, bitter as battery acid, and tasted faintly of rust. It was the best damn thing I'd ever drank. There were no crystal chandeliers here, no 12-foot trees covered in expensive glass ornaments, no suffocating cinnamon-scented candles trying to mask the stench of human rot. There were no silk dresses purchased with blood money. There was just cold concrete flickering fluorescent tubes and 12 heavily armed search and rescue operators sleeping on olive drab cots waiting for the klaxon to sound. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and looked at them. The guy snoring heavily on the cot closest to the door was Miller, a rescue swimmer from Detroit who dropped out of high school, got a GED, and now regularly jumped out of hovering helicopters into freezing 30-foot swells, just to pull strangers out of sinking commercial fishing boats. Next to him was Vasquez, a quiet, terrifyingly calm flight medic who could patch up a severed artery in complete darkness while the cabin pitched at 40 degrees. This was it. This was the actual definition of a bloodline. It was not the DNA you were randomly born into. It was not the people who demanded 70% of your paycheck just to allow you to sit in the dark, unlit corner of their mahogany dining table. Blood was the guy who checked your harness carabiner twice before you leaned out over a fatal drop. Blood was the crew who grabbed their heavy gear, racked their weapons, and walked straight into a Category 4 whiteout the absolute second I said the words, "Wheels up." No questions. No emotional manipulation. No calculating what was in it for them. Just absolute, unbreakable, lethal loyalty. The heavy metal side door of the hangar suddenly slammed open. A blast of sub-zero air rushed into the warm room, carrying a flurry of sharp ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Airman First Class Jenkins stepped through fighting with both hands and his body weight to get the heavy steel door latched shut behind him. He was 19 years old. His cheeks were raw and bright red from the vicious wind chill. He was clutching a crumpled day-old national newspaper in his heavy winter gloves. "Commander!" Jenkins yelled over the howling wind outside. His heavy boots squeaked against the wet concrete as he jogged over to the stove. He shoved the newspaper toward me, grinning like an absolute idiot. "You have to see this. The mail plane just dropped the weeklies off. The lower 48 is losing their minds over that extraction we pulled on the glacier last week." I did not take the paper. I just looked down at it. It was the front page of a major national syndicate. There was a blurry, grainy photograph of our Black Hawk hovering violently over a jagged, collapsing ice shelf. Above the photo, printed in massive, bold black ink, was the headline, "The Blizzard Angel Unknown. Navy pilot saves mountaineering team." I stared at the word angel. 3 years ago, standing in a perfectly manicured foyer in Atlanta, I would have killed for this kind of validation. I would have cut out the article, framed it behind expensive glass, and mailed it to my mother. I would have used it as a desperate plea to prove that I was worth something. just to beg for a fraction of the pride she gave Charlotte for picking out fabric swatches. I reached out and took the newspaper from Jenkins. The cheap paper was cold and damp against my calloused fingers. I did not read the article. I did not care what the reporters wrote. Public validation was just another form of control. A leash held by strangers. I rolled the newspaper into a tight, dense cylinder. I reached out with my left hand, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the potbelly stove, and yanked the metal door open. The heat blasted my face dry and fierce. I tossed the rolled-up newspaper directly into the center of the roaring orange coals. The dry paper caught instantly. The edges curled, turned black, and flared into bright, violent yellow flames. The acrid smell of burning ink hit my nose. The headline burned away in less than 2 seconds. The word "angel" turned to gray ash, glowed red for a fraction of a second, and crumbled into the thermal draft. I slammed the iron door shut. Clang. I looked at the young airman. I gave him a slow, hard half-smile. "Angels do not carry rifles, Jenkins," I said, my voice flat, cutting through his excitement with military precision. "And they sure as hell do not know how to bypass a frozen hydraulic line. Stop reading garbage. Go out to the pad and check the de-icing boots on rotor 2 for me." The pressure gauge was sticking on the last run. Jenkins blinked, staring at the closed iron door of the stove. Then his grin widened even further. He squared his shoulders and snapped a crisp, perfect salute. "Yes, ma'am, right away." He turned on his heel and jogged back out into the freezing, dimly lit hangar bay to do exactly what he was told. I turned back to the stove. I stood there alone, listening to the wood pop and crackle behind the thick iron door. The fire had completely consumed the vanity, the fake glory, the desperate, pathetic need to be seen by people who were determined to keep their eyes shut. You cannot save a ship that is rotting from the inside out. You cannot bail enough water to keep a toxic family afloat. You will just drown with them in the dark. You have to take the knife, cut the anchor line yourself, and let the dead weight sink to the bottom. I took a slow, deep breath of the freezing, fuel-scented air. My chest expanded. My spine was straight. My shoulders were light. There was no mortgage hanging over my neck. There was no phone ringing with endless selfish demands. Just the howling wind and the absolute silence of my own mind. This brutal, freezing, unforgiving sky. It belonged to me. If this story gave you the strength to cut your toxic anchors, hit like, drop a comment saying "free," and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.